Right now, as you're watching this video, an invisible force is pulling you, your phone, your home, and nearly 8 billion people on Earth toward the ground. It's so ordinary that most people never think about it for their entire lives. But what if it completely disappeared for just 10 seconds? No, I'm not talking about it getting weaker. I'm talking about it disappearing completely. Just 10 seconds. That may not sound like a long time, but those 10 seconds could become the longest moment in human history. The time which is 2:37 p.m. When the clock struck exactly 2:37 p.m., no alarms went off anywhere on Earth. There were no explosions. No one noticed the disaster that was about to begin, because at first, no one could feel that gravity had disappeared. The first thing to change wasn't the people. A small tennis ball lying on the ground quietly began to rise. Then, a plastic bag. Then, a newspaper. Within seconds, every lightweight object on the street began drifting up into the sky. At first, people thought it was a powerful gust of wind, but not a single leaf on the trees was moving. The air was perfectly still. Yet Earth was no longer the Earth we knew. And then, the first person lifted off the ground. The first person to rise, they didn't even notice it. And their next step never touched the ground. At first, they thought that they had simply lost their balance, but everyone just a few meters away was beginning to experience the exact same thing. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand, but there was no longer any force pulling them downward. Within seconds, hundreds of people were rising into the sky. Some screamed in fear, others thought they were dreaming. Then, every vehicle in the city began lifting off the ground, and at that moment, everyone realized this was no ordinary event. But while people stared up at the sky, no one noticed what was happening to the oceans. People were looking up at the sky. But the real disaster had already begun in the oceans. For the first few seconds, the sea remained almost perfectly calm. Then, something strange began to happen on the surface of the water. The waves stopped reaching the shore. It was as if the ocean was holding its breath. Then suddenly, tiny droplets of water began to rise. At first, just a few drops, then thousands of them. For the first time in their lives, people on the shore witnessed rain falling upward. The water was rising into the sky. And Earth was becoming a sight no living creature had ever seen before. But there was an even greater danger than the oceans, and no one had looked high enough to see it. What was happening on the ground was terrifying, but what was happening in the sky was even worse. At that very moment, nearly 10,000 passenger planes were flying above Earth. At first, the pilots thought their instruments had failed because the readings were showing values that shouldn't have been possible. Even passengers wearing their seatbelts began to drift slightly out of their seats. Tiny droplets of water inside the cabin began forming floating spheres. It wasn't just the airplanes. The birds no longer knew how to fly because the invisible balance that had kept them aloft was gone. For the first time, Earth could no longer control its own sky. But while all of this was happening, scientists around the world realized the exact same thing. This was more than just the loss of gravity. Gravity had disappeared for only 10 seconds. At the end of the 10th second, the invisible force returned. People fell back to the ground. Cars slammed back onto the roads. The birds in the sky began flapping their wings once again. Everyone took a deep breath. It looked like the disaster was over. But then, at observatories all around the world, the same alarm went off. The problem wasn't Earth. The problem was out in space. Gravity had returned, but something was missing from the universe. Gravity had returned, but on scientists' screens, the numbers no longer made any sense. Observatories across different continents were all receiving the exact same data. That should have been impossible, because the signal had arrived everywhere at the exact same moment. No information can travel faster than light, but this data seemed to ignore distance entirely. One scientist typed a single sentence onto the screen. This didn't begin on Earth. And at that moment, every research team turned its attention far beyond the sky. But what the telescopes had found wasn't a star. Gravity had returned, but Earth had not fully recovered. The most sensitive seismic stations detected unusual vibrations across the planet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was as if the entire Earth was ringing like a giant bell. The vibrations were incredibly weak, but they were identical everywhere on Earth. There had to be a natural explanation, but no scientific model could explain the data. That's when scientists turned their attention to the moon. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal until the computers highlighted a single pixel. That tiny red dot was about to change everything humanity believed. Every telescope pointed at the moon, found nothing unusual. That was the unexpected part, because according to every calculation, something should have changed. But everything around Earth was exactly where it was supposed to be. That's why the investigation began again from the beginning. This time, they stopped looking at the sky and started looking at time itself. Hundreds of atomic clocks around the world were compared. Then, the entire room fell silent, because every clock was telling the same story. The clocks weren't showing a missing 10 seconds. It was as if the universe itself had never experienced those 10 seconds. Scientists repeated the same calculation 417 times. The result was always the same. The clocks weren't broken. The data wasn't corrupted either. The only thing missing was time itself. It was as if the universe had quietly skipped 10 pages of a book, and we had only noticed that one page was missing. That's why it looked like gravity had disappeared. But it wasn't gravity that vanished. What disappeared, were 10 seconds from the universe itself. But if the universe really skipped those 10 seconds, what happened during them? For weeks, scientists chased a single question. If the universe really skipped 10 seconds, could it be proven? The answer was hiding in the last place anyone expected. Not on the internet, not in satellites, not even in human memory. The answer was inside a mechanical clock, because electronic systems can be reset. But gears made of steel, don't lie, the clock had never stopped. Yet one gear carried an unexplained mark, as if 10 seconds had vanished without a trace. The gear from the mechanical clock was placed under a microscope. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the magnification was increased, and everyone held their breath. There it was, a single line, thinner than the smallest thing they could measure. It wasn't caused by friction. It was as if time itself had touched that exact spot. The very same mark was found in hundreds of mechanical clocks across the world. This was no longer just a theory. The universe had left behind a trace, and in that moment, one scientist spoke only 4 words. It could happen again. The event had happened exactly 1 year ago. Life had returned to normal. People had started to forget what had happened, but the scientists never did, because every mechanical clock still carried the same mark, and that mark never changed. It was as if the universe itself had never forgotten that day. Then, exactly 1 year later, the oldest mechanical clock in the laboratory fell silent for a brief moment, and for the first time, not a single tick was heard. This time, no one looked up at the sky. 1 year passed, and nothing happened. Life looked ordinary again. People stopped looking at the sky because the human mind slowly turns the unexplained into something ordinary. But the universe never forgets. Maybe gravity never disappeared that day. Maybe the only thing that disappeared was time. And maybe we will never know what happened during those 10 seconds, because you cannot investigate a moment that no one can remember. And maybe the next missing second is closer than anyone thinks. Right now, the invisible force pulling you toward the ground feels constant, but who can truly promise it will never stop again? The archives were searched again and again. Billions of lines of data were compared one by one. And finally, they found a tiny record no one had ever considered important. The record did not come from Earth. It came from an old space probe drifting alone far beyond the solar system. That probe kept operating throughout the missing 10 seconds, and the last transmission it sent contained only one strange measurement. The stars had shifted from their positions for exactly 10 seconds. Then they returned to where they had always been, as if nothing had happened. That was the moment the scientists understood the truth. Gravity had not failed. Time had not broken. The universe had taken a single breath that lasted 10 seconds. Then one final question remained. Why did the universe breathe? Scientists searched for a single answer for years, but what they found was not an answer. It was only another question. Maybe we had been describing the universe the wrong way. Maybe gravity was never a force. Maybe it was the silent rhythm that kept the universe in order, and we had witnessed that rhythm fall silent for only 10 seconds. Maybe no disaster had happened. Maybe the universe had simply blinked, and we lived inside that single blink. Right now, the invisible force pulling you toward the Earth is doing its job perfectly. Maybe it will never stop for billions of years, or maybe the next silence will begin the moment I finish this sentence. But if that ever happens, none of us will remember it.